You are listening to the Pencil and Paper Podcast Network. Visit pencilandpaperproductions.podbean.com to find more great podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Cinema Salsa, your tasty condiment of film talk. I'm your zesty yet flavorful host, Stephen White. With me is my smooth and refreshing co-host, Philip Peck. Does refreshing seem right?
I hope so.
Okay.
I think you did a little walk in there.
I did.
You threw him like right in the middle.
I was trying.
I think it was the film talk.
Film talk. Yeah. I need more cowbell, as they say with the kids. I don't need it. I was trying to get into a mindset where I was being smooth and zesty, and I didn't do it. Or
You got overwhelmed by the spirit of walking.
Yeah, I did. It's amazing. It's amazing what the man does. So I wanted to start today's show by throwing something out there to you that you might find amusing. I read this today. We're going to talk about our favorite person, Zack Snyder.
Oh, no.
First of all, I'm sure you are aware, but now it's official. Army of the Dead 2 is happening. And there's also like
That's unfortunate.
Yeah. There's also like a spin-off prequel happening with one of the characters. Whatever it may be, it's happening.
I didn't pay much attention to it, but I saw that like apparently the streaming numbers, such as they are, or whatever, Netflix doesn't release a whole lot of information about their numbers, but apparently it's doing really, really, really well for Netflix. So not surprising.
Yeah. I guess if that's what you want to say. We'll actually get into some of that a little bit later. But right now, while we're on Snyder, now I know he's not necessarily responsible for this, but since this is Snyder adjacent, since this was his movie, this was the funniest thing that I've heard in a long time. Because despite whether you're a comic book fan or you're not, Superman seems to be kind of an introductory hero. Everyone knows Superman, Or at least I would imagine that's kind of the way it is. He's so ingrained into pop culture to a point where even if you don't know everything about him, you know the basics. You know he's an alien. You know he came from a planet that was dying, and now he's saving the world. Clark Kent, Superman, the glasses, the whole 9 yards. It all starts kind of pretty much with him. So you would assume people involved with making a Superman movie would have that knowledge ingrained. Apparently not. Writer David S. Goyer, who's kind of hit or miss in my book, he apparently was doing an interview with a magazine. He talked about a note that they received from Warner Brothers, the higher-ups, when they were making Man of Steel. He said, one note I got, this is all verbatim, by the way, one note I got was on Superman or Man of Steel, where the ending involved Superman utilizing the pod that he arrived in as a child in order to bring down General Zod's ship. The note they got from the studio said, quote, "You have to change that." When he asked why, their response was, quote, "Because if Superman uses that pod and it's destroyed while saving the city, how is he ever going to get back home to Krypton?" See the problem there?
Yes.
This comes from the studio fronting the money for one of their most popular characters ever.
So you're saying that the writer doesn't know the character?
No. The studio, the heads. This right here is a prime example of studios not knowing what they're paying for.
Oh, the studio didn't know.
Yeah, because the studio didn't like the idea of using his ship that he arrived in as a child as a weapon to take down Zod's ship. Because if he did, he can't get home to the planet that is rubble in space. It's just
Oh, right. Okay. Well,
this for me, this is a great example of studio interference in a way that is just like, this is why they need to stay away from it. You front the money, we'll do our jobs and we'll do it right. We'll do it well. Just step aside.
I was distracted because I didn't know who David S. Goyer was, and I was looking him up and noticed that he wrote this screenplay for your favorite superhero movie of all time,
Which is?
Blade.
He did. Yeah, that my absolute all-time favorite superhero film, Blade. Can't touch it. Nobody else can ever make. I mean, Marvel's going to try.
And your second favorite, Blade 2.
Yeah, I mean, you can't go wrong. You can't go wrong. These are the
originators.
The originators. The
Of the
superhero
Marvel-
films.
Of the cinematic universe.
Mm-hmm. Because no one knew who Blade was. They didn't even really slap a Marvel tag on the original movie.
Yeah, that's funny. Like, that was before that nobody cared, Like, they didn't care. It didn't matter that it was Marvel.
Yeah.
Because that's a bunch of dorky stuff for nerdy comic book readers.
And you know what's even more fascinating? Something that I guess I didn't really know as a comic fan. Like, I was aware of Blade when the movie came out because I'd read some books that he was kind of featured in. I think there was one called Night Stalkers, I think, that he was part of back in the 90s. So I was aware of him, and I remember that he was in an episode of like a Spider-Man animated series in the 90s. What I didn't realize, and I didn't find out until much later on, is that the character Whistler that they used in that movie, they actually took from that animated series. He didn't exist prior to that.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So I was like, that's interesting that you would see, not to say that it's unfounded, especially today. There's a lot of borrowing, but at the time, for kids' television, they're probably looking for ways to kind of change some of the narrative to kind of fit certain things that they need to kind of do, because Blade being a vampire or even a vampire killer, that's muddy water when it comes to children's television. I mean, they wouldn't even say blood. It was like, they're sucking plasma. Yeah, plasma. And it was just like, okay, I guess we'll let that slide. But
I remember getting into The Punisher in the early 90s, and the blood, such as it was colored brown. Even though it was clearly blood, they just couldn't even... The color red was a non-starter.
Yeah.
So
I think I've seen some of those,
times.
or at least, even other characters where it was like just a black goo. You're like, I guess that's supposed to be blood. But anyway, yeah, I thought I would share that with you because when I read that, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. That's exactly everything that we've been talking about over the past few weeks. Just that studio mindset of like, kind of very much in the same vein of this, I think, Kevin Smith's Superman story.
yeah,
When he was pitching the death of Superman, and the story pretty much went, John Peters, I think, is the producer, where he was like, does Superman need a cape? Does he need to have this? I'm like, all the defining features of Superman. You're like, what are you talking about, dude? This, so you're not even making Superman.
It really gets to the disparity between Marvel and DC, or Warner Brothers and the MCU, Disney, or whatever. The studios behind Marvel have just been much more get out of the way and let these people do what they know how to do.
Yeah.
And maybe Warner Brothers hasn't been, their executives and people in charge are just more unwilling to let go and just let the creative people who know what they're doing do what they need to do.
And even to kind of piggyback off of that, there was another video that I saw, and I might actually send this to you if I can remember, because I found it fascinating because I'd never really thought about it. Have you ever seen the movie Chef with Jon Favreau?
No, I haven't.
Okay. This is a fantastic movie that I highly recommend. You can probably find it on Netflix. He even created a show based sort of around it. It's called The Chef Show. It's also on Netflix. And it's not necessarily the same thing, but they instead on that just cook up dishes and stuff like that. Like the guy who actually worked with him behind the scenes on the movie to learn how to cook, he and Jon Favreau go to different restaurants around different cities and even just kind of sit in their own kitchen and just make up various kinds of food. They kind of show you what they're putting into it, but they don't go into like super great detail. They just kind of show you the fun and the enjoyment of cooking. But Chef, on the other hand, is about a man who worked in a restaurant. He kind of had, like he had a passion for doing that stuff. And then he was working in a restaurant where they kind of stifled that creativity. And he just kind of got frustrated with it to the point where he's like, you know what? I need to re-examine my love for this. So he buys a food truck, goes out on the road, and kind of reignites his passion for cooking, which, I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's kind of a base idea or concept of the plot.
Yeah.
Without going into great detail. And I would highly recommend you actually, I don't know if I'd want you to watch the movie first or understand the little detail first. But I watched a video that kind of deconstructed the making of that movie and hypothesized, whether it's true or not, but it made a lot of great points, is that that movie is essentially Jon Favreau's frustration with making Iron Man 2. And when you look at all the details laid out, when he talks about, or the guy in the video talks about it, I was like, holy shit. Yeah, I can see it. Even certain little details that you wouldn't even think of in the moment, they make more sense with all that context. And he doesn't outright, like in a lot of the scenes where the frustration is there, he doesn't come outright and say, oh yeah, this is exactly it. Even Jon Favreau himself has not openly said that's what it is. But if you really look at it through that lens, at the timing of it all adds up. So it's a fascinating study of that film that I'd never thought about. And now I want to go back and rewatch the film with that context in mind to see if I can pick up on those details. So I would recommend that. I'll send you that video so you can kind of check it out at your leisure, and definitely check out Chef. It's one of those movies I overlooked for some time, but I eventually did watch, and I highly recommend it.
It seems like an overlooked movie, but it has a lot of really big actors in it.
Yeah.
Of course, Jon Favreau is a big director as well, and was able to get all these people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really know much. I don't even know if I'd even heard of it. So
yeah, it's definitely one of those underrated films that just kind of flew under a lot of people's radar, and I want to get people to watch it because it's a really good movie.
Yeah, I'm interested to watch it just based on who's in it.
Yeah. So what have you been watching outside of, or what have you been watching since we last spoke?
I've watched a few things. I watched the Tomorrow War.
Okay, now how was that? That's exactly why I was kind of iffy about watching it.
It wasn't great.
Okay.
And yeah, it's pretty generic stuff. It didn't do anything. I mean, the premise was, in my opinion, the premise was pretty interesting, or it could have been interesting, but what they did with it was pretty generic. It's way too long. It goes on and on and on. Like one too many. Well, yeah, it just took too long to get to the end.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got some good things in it. It's got some good moments. The premise I liked. Yeah, I don't know. It's just pretty generic, and I think it suffers from association being on TV. I can't let go of this thing where I feel like movies that get released to streaming or get released to TV seem like straight to video.
Yeah.
Even if they're not. Like, I don't know what the budget is for this movie. It was probably a lot. But it just doesn't seem like the kind of movie that you would go to the theater and see. Even if it is. Like, even if this movie, which I'm sure it was slated to release in theaters. And I don't even know if it was initially produced by or funded by Amazon, or if it just fell into Amazon's lap like so many movies are, and which we're going to talk about later too.
Yeah.
But it just had that kind of cheesy B-movie vibe to me, and that just might be my own bias by watching it at home. Yeah, it's not great. And
Okay.
Chris Pratt's like, I don't know, I'm not super familiar with his work. I've seen Parks and Rec. I've seen Jurassic Park, whatever the ones that he's been in. I'm not a huge fan, especially like in this context. I'm not a fan of him as an action lead. He's got this open mouth, kind of like this gaping, dumb look to him. Not that he's a dumb guy, but like that's his like kind of his acting, his resting acting face.
Right.
Even the aliens, they don't really do much. They're not that original. They just seem like a mashup of like all these other ideas as opposed to something that's like interesting or cool.
Right.
Yeah. It's like it's a mashup.
Okay.
That you could use that to describe the whole movie. But I mean, I did watch it as opposed to Army of the Dead, which I didn't watch. So I guess that's saying something. I at least watched the whole thing.
Right. Okay. So that's a plus.
Yeah, and I watched it with my wife. Maybe if we watched maybe if we sat down together and watched Army of the Dead, I would get through the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Maybe not. But I watched the Fear Street Trilogy, which we'll hopefully talk about in a bit. Mm-hmm. And I watched Adaptation, which I never watched the whole thing. I think I started watching that 20 years ago when it was released, and I never got through it. I don't know why, but I watched Adaptation, which was, if anybody's not familiar, this is written by Charlie Kaufman. It's about Charlie Kaufman. He's a screenwriter, obviously. He wrote the movie, but it's about him as a screenwriter. It's a very meta-referential kind of movie, starring Nicolas Cage. And Nicolas Cage plays Charlie Kaufman, but he also plays his twin brother, Donald Kaufman. It's freaking fun. It's funny. Like, their dynamic in the movie.
Yeah.
Nicolas Cage with himself is just a great. I mean, it's worth watching just for that alone. Watching him play
Right.
Charlie Kaufman and his own brother, it's hilarious. And I think it's a little bit of an uneven movie, but it's the last act of it, the third act of it, it's like, what in the hell is going on? You just don't think it's gonna. You don't think that it's gonna go where it goes or do what it does, and it's just like, yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah, I remember.
Have you seen it before?
Yeah, it's been a while, but I remember being entertained with it. I was like, this is actually really good. One of the few Nicolas Cage movies I really enjoyed.
Oh, really?
I mean, I don't want to knock the man as an actor, but some of the stuff he's done in recent years, he's kind of gone a little off the rails.
He's gone off the rails, but I think that's so interesting. Like, he was one of the big movie stars in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. And for whatever reason, I mean, I don't follow his biography and everything, but even so, like, he's made some interesting movies in the last few years. Like, there's one out right now that it's getting a lot of press. I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, but he plays like an ex-chef or something, and somebody steals his pig, so he goes on this like, it's called The Pig?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's getting a lot of like positive buzz and reviews for that movie.
That is one that it's starting to, because of all that, I'm actually intrigued.
Yeah.
Because I heard he's a little bit more reserved and not as, nutty.
Yeah, he's a kind of like Al Pacino, where he can go off the rails and just go like full, like just ham it up in the worst possible way. But it's funny, like Al Pacino's an actor. I think there was I never thought about this until now, so I could be totally full of shit, but a little bit of some parallels between them. Like when you think about Al Pacino and The Godfather, like severely underacting, at least until The Godfather, at least in Godfathers 1 and 2. Like, he's not doing a whole lot that's like, it's demanding your attention in the fact that he's acting well.
Yeah.
But then you go into like Son of a Woman, where he scandalously won best actor. It's like, give me a break. Like, give that to fucking Denzel Washington. But yeah, where he's just like over the top and just screaming and yelling and being, goofball. I think Nicolas Cage does the same thing, where he's got movies where he's just like Raising Arizona, where he first started out. Like, it's a very eccentric movie and it's an eccentric performance, but it's like, well, it's the Coen brothers for one, but it's not like over the top acting. It's like, I think it's very considered and reasoned acting. But yeah, anyway, so he's getting it back. So this movie's great. If you haven't seen it, it's a fantastic performance by him in two roles. And I also watched the new Mutants. Have you seen that one?
Yeah.
What did you think about that? You're like,
I mean, there was a good concept there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that I was just like, oh my God, this is the biggest travesty that this movie will never go on. But you could tell it had problems. Like, it could have been something different. But I didn't hate it, but I wasn't just like...
Yeah, I didn't hate it, but I did... I liked it for being kind of a minor movie in the superhero genre, in the Marvel MCU. It's like... Or is it an MCU movie?
Not technically. I mean, these are Marvel characters.
It was a Fox movie. Now it's a 20th century movie.
Yeah.
Because Fox is no longer...
Technically the last X-Men related movie of the Fox era. Because I think they had finished it back in...
Yeah, it's been around. It's been sitting in the can for a bit.
Yeah, and it just kept getting delayed until it was just like, just put it out there, crying out loud.
So it's not great. It's pretty. It has a lot of stuff we've seen before, in kind of like these teenage coming of age movies. But I liked it for being kind of a genre movie as opposed to a big superhero movie. Mm-hmm. That to me made it more interesting than even something like the Avengers. So it was decent.
Yeah.
I watched Midnight Run, which is just on Netflix now, and just because it had Robert De Niro and have you ever seen that?
It's been a long time.
It is terrible.
Really?
It sucks. It's way too long. It's just like a series of events just strung out in sequence. It's like the plot is just like, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Like the structure is just and. It's like I don't know, like an improv where it's like the technique is that somebody says something and the next person goes, and then it's ridiculous. I don't know. I don't know how it was regarded when it came out, but I'm sure it wasn't highly regarded, but it was not good. I only watched it because of who was in it and just because I didn't have anything else to watch. But this is definitely not one of those 80s movies that we've talked about kind of like being more than they seem, like maybe Lethal Weapon or Die Hard or what was the one with Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte?
Oh, 48 Hours.
48 Hours, yeah. Mm-hmm. Those movies they stand the test of time, problematic as they may be, especially 48 Hours, where it's like, oh my God, this movie's racist as shit. Anyway, Midnight Run, very minor. And then last night I watched A Nightmare on Elm Street. I'd never seen it.
The original?
The original.
Okay.
The original one. I was, that movie came out in 84, so I was definitely way too young at 4 to watch that movie. But it was one of those movies that, as you grew up, and preteen, teenager, it was one of those movies that you would spend the night at people's house and watch it. I was always too scared to watch it, and my mom and dad were like, no, don't watch that movie. So I never did, although I did see a lot of other horror movies, but it was never one that I did see at that age when I was a period. Yeah. But I was always too scared to watch it. But since I watched Fear Street, I've been wanting to go back and watch some of the touch-tone movies that Fear Street references. It just interested me, so I was like, I'm definitely going to watch this tonight. And it's a really good movie.
It is.
It's not scary at all for me at this point in my life.
Right.
It didn't scare me. It wasn't even very suspenseful. Like there was a couple moments where you're like kind of, heart rate a little bit elevated, a little jumpy a little bit, but it's not. Freddy Krueger in this movie was not a scary villain. He was very cheesy. Yeah. And I think he only got cheesier as the sequels, went on and all the one-liners and things like that. But even in this original one, I'm sure for people in that time period watching this movie fresh, were probably scared, and especially teenagers watching it were probably scared. But it doesn't necessarily hold up in terms of like being scary.
Right.
But it's a really interesting movie. It's got fantastic concepts. It's got really fantastic visuals, and some of the nightmares that they have, and some of the things that happen just visually. There's a lot of really cool ideas, and and things. So I enjoyed it, even though it wasn't very scary.
That's fair.
And the music is just like, they don't do things like that anymore. I don't know. It's I don't know.
It does definitely have a very unique score. I think that's Elmer Bernstein, who's done a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I think he's the guy. I think he did Halloween too, right? Or
Carpenter did Halloween.
What's that?
Carpenter did Halloween. John
He
Carpenter.
did that.
Yeah.
What?
Elmer Bernstein, if I'm not mistaken, he did. I feel like he did Psycho. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I feel like he did Psycho. I know he did Ghostbusters. I mean, he's got a lot of popular tunes under his belt, or at least movies that have iconic scores, things like that. Bernard Herrmann, that's who did Psycho. I don't know where I got Elmer Bernstein.
Yeah, there was another horror movie that he did. Was it?
Come on, brain. Come on, brain. You can do it. Nope.
He did Cujo.
Cujo. See, there you go. There's another one. To Kill a Mockingbird. That was the one I was trying to think of. The Magnificent Seven, True Grit, The Ten Commandments, Three Amigos, Heavy Metal. Come on. I mean, Stripes, Animal House, Meatballs. The list goes on. Man's done a lot.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what I was thinking about in terms of horror movies. He did Rosemary's Baby. Oh no, he did Look What's Happened to Rosemary's Baby. A lot of B movies. What have you watched?
Well, let's see. I was trying to make sure that I had everything listed in my brain. I know that I watched Black Widow, which I don't know if you got around to watching that or not. But I got around to watching that. I did not go see it in theaters like I'd planned, because I remember saying here that was supposed to be the movie that I go back to the theater to see, and it just didn't work out that way. So I did the whole Disney Plus thing because it was just going to come out about the same anyway. So I said,
"Shame on you."
I know. I'm disappointed in myself for that.
We've been wanting to go see it in theaters too, and we haven't gone to the theaters yet. So yeah. I don't hold it against you at all.
We'll get back to it eventually, but it was a movie. That it was entertaining. I didn't dislike it, but I wasn't just like, oh God, it was a good spy movie, I guess, sort of, with some action that happens. Don't expect great things. That's all I'm saying. I didn't hate it. I don't really know. I can't just. This was not Avengers Endgame. It's like we just hit the reset button and was like, all right, we're going back to smaller things. It's a smaller Marvel movie. If you like,
I don't mind. Like I was talking about with New Mutants, I kind of liked it for being a genre film as opposed to a full-on superhero movie.
This
but I see what you're saying. There, like the reviews, like early reviews for Black Widow, like you had seen some people who were like, "This is the best Marvel movie ever." And then people are like, no. What are you watching?
I mean, it's more in line with the Winter Soldier, where it kind of has that, it teeters that line to where it's not necessarily a superhero film, but there are fantastic elements in it to a point. But it leans more toward a grounded spy espionage narrative. So, and I think that's where you have to be in that mindset. Don't walk in thinking you're watching a big superhero. Like, you don't expect Iron Man or the Hulk to come in and just start tearing stuff up. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, and I like that, because when you think about superhero stories, like anytime your run-of-the-mill Black Widow comic or your run-of-the-mill Daredevil comic, or maybe even something like the Avengers, the X-Men, there were so many stories, there were so many months where it was smaller stories. Mm-hmm. Where it could have been interpersonal storytelling, or it could have been just kind of like this minor villain that was coming in to do something, wreak some havoc in a way. It didn't always have to be this apocalyptic, end of the world, save the world or else kind of narrative. Yeah. And I get bored of the superhero movies that end in, or that are involving those kinds of stakes where cities are demolished and they kind of gloss over these holocausts and everything that happen all the time. I like when you use superhero, when you have the superheroes kind of telling a more constrained kind of narrative where it's just, it doesn't have to be.
This would definitely be up your or in your wheelhouse if that's what you're looking for. Something a little bit more personal. It does, and I've heard this argument, and I kind of have to agree, it feels a little too late. And I just mean in the sense that, spoilers, she's dead, technically.
Yeah.
And then now we're kind of shoving this in. Like, okay, well, this happened after Captain America Civil War. It's like, yeah, but we know what happens. I mean, this would have been great after Captain America Civil War. You shove that in between whatever other movies you put in. Give her that story then. Because now you have these little moments, and this is one of those irritating little moments that I'm starting to dislike with prequel movies, where they have that one little item or that one little thing. Because they did that a lot with the Star Wars movies, the last batch. It was like, hey, you remember that dice or that die that was hanging in the Millennium Falcon? We're going to put that in Solo. Yeah? Now you see it? There it is. That's how he got it. Yeah, and you're just like, well, did we need to see that? They did kind of a moment in that. It's like this vest she was wearing in Infinity War. It's like, you like that vest, don't you? It's like, yeah, it's kind of nice. It's got pockets. She's going to get that vest. It's like, but that doesn't, who cares? I wasn't thinking about the vest when I was watching that movie.
Yeah, but some people care. Like, they must do that because they think that well, this could be a topic for another podcast where we're talking about cinema or talking about movies versus content, what the distinction is between that or what those terms actually mean.
Right.
But I would kind of come down on the side that they're looking at these things as content as opposed to as cinema. So you're looking at things like how, engagement. Not only how many tickets can we sell and how many people go and watch the movies, but what are people talking about on Twitter? Like, that must be factoring into some of these decisions that are made in terms of what's in the movie. So they're throwing in these little Easter eggs so that they get mentions on Twitter and Instagram or whatever, which is totally dumb, right? It's a dumb way to make a movie, but it's really how movies are being made, or certain type of movies are being made.
I mean, that's a valid point. Outside of that, I'm going to piggyback off of that because I've got two here I could talk about, but I'm going to try to keep it simple. Simply put, since I also watched something in the same genre, Mission Impossible. I kind of had this nagging, I just kind of wanted to watch Mission Impossible. So I found all 6. Says I hadn't seen the last 2. And I decided I'm going to watch these day by day by day. So just every evening for the past week, I just watched one movie. Do you like Tom Cruise? Are you a Tom Cruise fan?
I do. And I was just thinking about that, like in comparison to someone like Chris Pratt, Mm-hmm. He's a way more charismatic action star.
Yeah.
And people have like various feelings about Tom Cruise, and I understand that, but in terms of like somebody who can carry those kinds of movies, he's way better than a lot of people who we have nowadays. But
I think
he's not letting go at 69 years old or whatever he is.
I mean, he's definitely one of those that I don't actively seek out their movies, but when I do watch him in a movie, I can't help but have mad respect for the man because
I've always been a big fan of the Mission Impossible movies.
Yeah.
I've never I'm curious to go back and watch the first one because it seems to be the most maybe more genre movie as opposed to they get more and more blockbuster. I guess, but the first one was directed by
Brian De Palma.
What's his name? Yeah. Yeah. So he's got a totally different aesthetic and a different take on things. So that one, it seemed cheesy to me when I watched it back in the day when it was new. But I haven't seen it since then. But I'd be curious to go back and watch it now.
I would say, and even kind of looking at the people behind the scenes with all the directors. I mean, they've had top-notch directors every time. Yeah. I mean, Brian De Palma, John Woo, J.J. Abrams, who actually stayed on from 3 till the current one as like producer. So at least they had that kind of watching their back a little bit. And then you had Brad Bird and Christopher McQuarrie, I think, did the last two, which I know he's done a lot, or at least action stuff. I feel like he did another one. I think he did that one, Edge of Tomorrow, with Tom Cruise as well. But I don't quote me on that unless you look it up. But the movies are solid. The only one I would say that I kind of faded in and out on was probably part 2. There was just something kind of right there in the middle that I just kind of lost interest. Like, it just wasn't keeping my attention. But then when you got back to the end and the action kind of kicked back up again, I was like, all right, well, now I'm back. But the rest of them, I felt like they had a stronger narrative. I felt like they had bigger stakes to a point. It kept me more engaged. That 2 felt like an odd, the black sheep out of the lot, I guess.
2 was even... I love 2 because of when it came out, I was really into John Woo. I was really into Hard Boiled and The Killer. Yeah. And so it was like, even though like Broken Arrow kind of sucked. Oh, but I love a Face Off. I loved that movie at the time. So I was all into what John Woo was doing. I don't know how it holds up now. I haven't seen it.
I mean, again, I won't say that it was like unwatchable by no means. Will I say that? I feel like it didn't hold my attention like all the rest of them did. Like, there was a moment where I just kind of checked out for a minute. I was like, I really don't know what's going on 100% right now. But then at one point, it just kind of got me back. It was like, hey. I was like, oh, okay, I'm back. So
because he throws that whole mask thing that he did in Face Off into
and
Mission Impossible.
They rely on that quite a bit in each movie. Which can work and also be kind of like, all right, well, this is kind of a cop-out. But whatever.
Yeah, it's a kind of gimmick. Sure. Just let me interject real quick. Christopher McQuarrie, he wrote, he's credited with the screenplay for Edge of Tomorrow.
Okay.
But he didn't direct it. So all he's directed is Mission Impossible. He directed Jack Reacher, also starring Tom Cruise.
Okay, that's the one I'm thinking of, I think.
And he directed Way of the Gun, which I'm not familiar with, but...
I know the name. I don't think I've seen it.
Oh, that's got Ryan Phillippe and Benicio del Toro and Juliette Lewis. I think I've seen that. But anyway,
but overall, I mean, it was a fun watch. Like, I actually got. I think my wife had the movies confused. I think she was mistaking them for the Bourne series. Because she was like,
an easy mistake to make.
Yeah, I guess.
The same movie, kind of repackaged in a different way, I guess.
But she's like, I thought these movies were supposed to be boring. I thought they were just supposed to be terrible. Why are you watching these? I was like, what are you talking about?
These movies are good.
Yeah.
They are, like, I don't love them. Especially the last few were just way over the top. And they go on too long. There's too many set pieces. It's like, almost like the Zack Snyder kind of way of filmmaking where it's like we can probably lose a little bit of this, but all of them have like amazing set pieces in them, amazing fight sequences and choreography and stunts. They all have something worth watching in them, even if they don't all hold up through their whole duration.
Another movie that I watched was Gunpowder Milkshake on Netflix. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I've been wanting to check that out. I've heard mixed things, but how's that?
It was entertaining. It was one of those gun crazy, like the stunts just go balls out nuts. Stories, I won't say uneven. It's just it kind of slows at some points and then it kind of picks back up. So the pacing could be a little sharper. But when it comes to the action, just a lot of the set pieces in that, it's a lot of fun. I mean, you know what you're getting into when you see the crazy hyper violence, I guess you'd say. It's not like super gory, but it's got those scenes in there where it's just a little over the top. Kill Bill-esque, I guess, would be a great way of looking at it.
I haven't seen it, but I was thinking as you talked about that, like John Woo movies, like the Hong Kong.
A little bit more over the top, or maybe not as high over the top as some of those can be. Like, but again, I would say it's worth a watch. I wouldn't say that you're going to be just completely bored with it or anything like that. It's a fun movie just to kind of check out. I would recommend it just at least for one good watch.
Yeah.
Finally, the last thing that I watched, this was one of those that I wanted to see. I may have mentioned here. It's called The Amusement Park. It was supposedly a lost film from George Romero.
Yeah, you mentioned that several weeks ago.
Yeah, they released it on Shudder. It's really I wouldn't even call it a film. It's maybe like not even an hour long, and it comes off almost like a PSA against elder abuse. I could be absolutely wrong. Maybe read the wrong message, but that's what I gathered from it. Because they started off with the main actor of the short talking about, what they're doing, what the production is about, where they got to shoot, some of the extras that were in there, just kind of giving you a rundown of everything that you're about to watch. And then you watch this man go to this amusement park and by the end of it, you feel so terrible for this man because no one gives him any, they just don't pay attention to him. They're shoving him aside. It's just, and all he wants to do is just enjoy his time at this amusement park. And every time he turns around, somebody is shitting on him, or he's just being mistreated, and it's really sad. And then of course it finishes out with the actor coming back and kind of giving you a little rundown, saying what you could do to help elderly people in your neighborhood. And it's really bizarre because this is not what I was expecting, but that's what I got.
Yeah. When you mentioned it, there was a David Denby's film critic for The New Yorker, and he had a write-up about it a little bit after you had mentioned it previously, and I read it, and it literally is a work for hire. It says the amusement park, I'm reading from the Wikipedia page now, is the Romero's only work for hire. It was commissioned by the Lutheran Service Society of Western Pennsylvania as an educational film about elder abuse and ageism. And his wife says at some point later on, they did use it initially, but I suspect they thought it was a little edgier than they would have liked, and it was soon shelved. So this was commissioned by the Lutheran Society to, almost like a PSA, like you said, but being George Romero, he made the thing that they probably were a little bit put off by in a way. It was probably shown at some point somewhere in Pennsylvania and maybe nowhere else, or maybe across like Lutheran networks throughout the country. But like she says, it probably didn't have a long shelf life because people are like, oh, what are we doing? What are we watching here? So it's kind of an interesting, even though you probably didn't know what you were getting into, but what you got was probably something that was like confusing, but also very interesting.
I mean, I didn't turn it off. I was in for the long haul. I was like, all right, let's see what happens. But I felt like it was effective, despite what they were looking for. Again, by the end, I was like, man, why are they doing this to this poor man? What is going on? And all you wanted to do was help him out. That's
what David Denby was saying. The same thing. It's like, this is a good movie. Like, this is a good film. Whatever this is, like, this thing is working in a way that's affecting. It's interesting that it would pop up in 2021 without the context of what it was, you know?
Right.
Like, you would have to do some research about, like, what is this thing? Why did it, is this a lost film? Or so it's weird that it pops up now and people are talking about it as if it's some sort of like original piece or lost George Romero film, as opposed to like really what it was. But but it's cool that you can see it though. That's, the cool thing is you can see it and judge it for your on your own and on its merits.
Yeah, for sure. So check it out, Shudder, if you got it. Not a sponsor, but it's not even an hour long. So if you've got an hour to spare, I watched it before I went to bed one night because I thought, I'm not really tired. I got an hour. Why not? Again, it's worth checking out at least once, like everything else.
Especially if you're a fan of George Romero and want to know, like, it's such an interesting concept, like why would they even approach him to do that?
Really.
It's just the whole concept or the whole origination of this project. It's like, what? You know? So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And I'd be down for checking it out.
So let's talk about our headline today, if you'd like. And I guess I want to try to understand exactly where you're coming from with this, because I'm pretty sure I got an idea, but we'll see what happens. So we've been talking this entire time about the movies we watched. One thing we've kind of mentioned off and on is Fear Street. I know we've mentioned before that we watched one of them, or at least the first one, but we've watched all of them at this point. And I never thought in a million years that if you told me that I was going to enjoy a Fear Street movie, that would be a thing that would happen. But here we are, you know, because it's not one of those things that I was ever a fan of. Like, I didn't go out and read the books. I knew of them, but it's just not anything that interested me. Now, the trilogy of films that were released, they were all released on Netflix, one at a time. If you're unaware, July 2nd, the one in 1994, and then the week after, 1978, week after that, 1666. That's right. I don't know what I was going to say, 1966. Each film stood kind of on its own while kind of building a larger narrative, that a curse had befallen this town of Shadyside. And we'll try to be as spoiler-free as we can as we talk about this, but we're not really going to go into the stories per se. We're really focused on the business model that was working here, because these were supposed to be theatrical films, correct? I mean,
So
that's what we heard.
This trilogy was shot in 2019,
and they've
with
been
the
holding
intention.
on to
It was the production company is Chernin. I'm not sure I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but then the larger studio behind it was Fox.
Okay.
21st Century Fox. So they were funding it. Chernin was producing it, and it was slated to be released in theaters. So,
and obviously we didn't get that, but what I kind of found interesting about this whole concept is they had 3 movies they could have easily split up over a decent amount of time, but yet they kind of created a bingeable, much in the same or in the vein of Netflix, a bingeable series of movies that people will come back for week after week. Luckily, they didn't just drop all 3 at once and say, here, go to town on it. They could have, but they didn't. But I think this is actually a bingeable approach in theory. Again, not back to back to back, but on a weekly basis. Not something that Netflix is known to do, since all their shows just drop every episode at once, while everyone else is going back to the weekly model. But it worked, because I found myself eager for the next movie and the next one and the next one. And they were good movies. They weren't schlock. They weren't, super garbage
they're definitely
movies.
schlock.
Okay, they're schlock. They're schlocky, but they weren't, like, I didn't sit there.
In a good way.
Yeah, in the best possible way. They weren't just groundbreaking films, but I guess the approach itself is something that has never been done per se, because if you think about it, this approach normally doesn't work. And I'm really curious to know how this approach would have worked had they actually released them in theaters, because we'll look at a few case in point. The Matrix, Reloaded, and Revolutions, 2 movies that were filmed back to back, and they were going to be released. I think it was like one in April of whatever year that came out, and then one in November, whatever time that came out. Both films are, I'm sure someone out there loves them, but I would say they are not good at all. They're confusing. They're just a jumbled mess. And it feels like there are a lot of concepts that could have worked better together as opposed to splitting them into 2 movies. And this became a thing that we saw. Harry Potter did it. Twilight did it. Where it's like, well, we got to take that last book and we got to split it up into 2.
The Hobbit.
The Hobbit. And then it's just this way of digging extra footage or an extra movie out of something that doesn't need it. Pirates of the Caribbean did it. You know, they did 2 and I don't remember what the hell they were called. 2 and 3. Also, just I think they are not good movies. I'm trying to be as polite as I can because people might like them. I have no beef with Pirates of the Caribbean. It's just they're not.
Well, I think all those series that you mentioned have their adherents and have their fans, but I feel like the people are fans of the larger story, the characters, the world, and everything like that. And not necessarily the movies themselves.
Yeah. And in a lot of ways, I mean, again, this is all subjective. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I honestly don't feel like it really depends on how the story is being laid out, and they're not just trying to stretch for time just to get an extra movie out of it. Something like Superman, if we want to go into Donner's world for a moment, they had written, like Mario Puzo wrote like a 4-hour epic Superman. They're like, whoa, we can't do that. So split that in half. And that kind of worked out, you know. But if you're trying to create another movie based on nothing, I could see where that would give you lesser thans. But these seemed very focused on what they had. They knew exactly what they were trying to do. They had 3 stories they were going to tell, and then they were going to tie them together in the end, and somehow magically pulled it off without really missing a beat. Because they all stand, like there's not a weak link among them. In fact, I would even argue that the last film was the strongest out of the 3.
Well, so it's interesting. So the source material, R.L. Stine's Fear Street, there's, I guess, hundreds of books to draw from. And they didn't adapt any specific book. They adapted like the world and created a story based on that world, based on some of the characters, or, you know, based on the town, all that kind of stuff. So this is an original story based on, I mean, just even the concept. So the Fear Street books are an anthology. They're not interconnected in any way. They're all standalone stories. Take place in the same world, but they all tell disparate stories, and they don't necessarily connect to each other. So they basically took that concept or took that world and said, let's tell a self-contained story within that world, and it's gonna span 3 movies. And whoever had the idea at Fox or at Chernin or whatever were like, let's do a trilogy, and we want to shoot 3 movies, and we want to release them all in the same year. So kind of, I think they were thinking, or maybe the model was the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where they shot great portions, if not the entire series, all at the same time. I mean, I haven't gone back and looked at how those movies were filmed, but they shot portions of them at the same time and then released them as discrete movies. So they were like, we're going to shoot these at the same time, and then we're going to release them all in the same year. Whereas something like, again, The Lord of the Rings, were like, I can't remember, where they released it years apart, 1 year apart, or was it 2 years apart?
I feel like it was a year apart, like
December
I think it was. Of every year.
So they were like, we want to release all these within a year. So a couple months apart. So that's a very compressed timeline for movies to be shown in the theater.
Right.
So that was kind of like the original concept of this whole thing.
It seems risky, especially for a studio to take that kind of risk on a director, especially the director who really only had one big movie. And I wouldn't even call that big. I'm being generous.
Yeah, and like no one's heard of it.
Yeah.
Unless you're in that genre, like if you're a genre fan. But
right. She didn't have a whole lot going for her. I mean, it was I'm guessing from what I heard, it was a critically acclaimed horror movie for what it was. But that was it. And she really didn't have any other credits. A few TV credits, I think, for Scream. But this, for me, looking at it from a studio side, this is a gamble. I mean, how are you going to... You have no idea if you're going to recoup your money back for 3 movies on a director that's not necessarily well-known, I mean, you're really banking on the series name itself to carry
that's what I was going to say. Like, this is definitely, you're thinking we can capitalize on how many millions of people read those books, you know, like probably there were a lot of people who read those books. So name recognition alone, you're hoping to draw people in. But again, you're right. Like, other than that, actors, directors, writers, like, you've got no credibility or no cachet to capitalize on.
I mean, there was really only one actor in the entirety of each movie that I knew. Like, oh, I know that person. Everybody else was new.
Who was
to me.
that?
Jillian Jacobs, the one that played the older, I can't remember her character's name. She was the camper that survived from 1978. Grown up.
Yeah.
Now, some of them look familiar, but I couldn't tell you what I knew them from. So, and again, not to knock her, but she's not, I wouldn't consider her like a well-known actress that's just everybody knows. The only reason I even know her is from like Community from way back
right.
when.
I mean, I think that's it's the horror genre where this is the kind of thing that the horror genre can capitalize on, where you have a lot of unknowns. Like, the horror genre is like a place where you can break out or generate big stars. Going back to Nightmare on Elm Street, this is Johnny Depp's debut. Mm-hmm. Where, I mean, you've got a bunch of no names, and Halloween, it's Jamie Lee Curtis's debut. It is a genre where you can actually build a star, where you don't necessarily need a star because it doesn't cost a lot of money. And that's where I would also go back to what we're talking about here. Like, even though you're producing 3 films at a time, which is in this genre is pretty unheard of, but maybe, like, think about it in the bigger picture where it's a horror movie, or it's a horror trilogy. So even though you're making 3 at a time, it probably isn't costing all that much. And they're also they shot all of them. They shot them all. They didn't take any breaks.
Yeah.
So you're also compressing that time. You're not calling people back. You're not recreating everything. So it's like this is all happening at the same time. Shooting all 3 movies within a 106-day window, I believe it was. So you're right. It's a gamble, but in the bigger picture, it's not like that huge of a gamble.
Did you happen to notice, because I would assume this is one of those, like you said, it was meant to go to theaters and then Netflix bought it up. Did you happen to notice how much they paid for the series of films?
No, I didn't. I didn't see anything about the money. But that's another interesting thing. So it seems like the reason that this got done, this became available for Netflix is because, so this was a 20th Century Fox production. And then at some point during this whole production, 20th Century Fox got bought by Disney. Mm-hmm. And what they were making was not palatable for Disney.
Right.
So you've seen it. You've seen the trilogy. This is not a Disney product.
No.
So Disney was like, nah, we don't want this shit. And at that point, and I don't know how this all played out, but it was like basically Sherman was like, well, it's not getting made by Fox, but we still have the intellectual property is ours. It's not Fox's. So they went to Netflix, and Netflix picked it up.
Okay.
So the whole reason that it didn't even get COVID was probably a factor, but in the long run, the reason that it went to Netflix is because Disney bought Fox, and Disney didn't want anything to do with the slasher trilogy of movies.
Which is ironic considering they used to own Dimension Films, which was known for slasher films like Scream and so on and so forth. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Bunch of hypocrites.
Well, yeah. Well, it's the evolution of a business and of a corporate identity where,
like, what are they going to do with
back
Fox?
in the 90s, they were cool with it, and now they're not. So
I guess. Do you think these movies would have succeeded at the box office? Do you think they would have been a hit? Do you think their plan would have paid off?
I have no idea. It would just depend on the marketing, how much buzz they could build, and then in COVID too. Like, take COVID out of the equation. If we're in a normal box office time period where theaters are open and nothing's going on, yeah, I think that could be a hit. Like, think about I mean, horror movies are, nothing's guaranteed in Hollywood, but horror movies are generally huge moneymakers. Like, it doesn't take a lot of money to produce a horror movie, and then the ones that actually succeed make huge profits. So I could definitely see studios were like, oh yeah, we'll do this, because how much does this movie cost, you know? Or how much do these trilogy movies cost? Like you already mentioned, there's no big actors in it, so you're not paying huge salaries for actors, which is a major portion of any budget of any movie that actually has name actors in it. Like probably 50% or more is going towards their salary. So you don't have that. So even though you're funding 3 movies at a time, in the scheme of things, it's probably not even that big, like a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall budget. So would they succeed? We don't know. But I could see them succeeding based on the name recognition of the R.L. Stine, based on how many people in the 90s and the early 2000s are reading those books. If they had come up with an effective marketing campaign, I could see these movies being successful. And if they had played up the fact that there's 3 movies, they're in the can, they're ready to go. You go see this one, 2 months later, the second one's coming out, and then another 2 months after that, the third one's coming out. I think that could have been a cool thing.
I mean, it worked for Netflix.
Yeah, it worked for Netflix when you compress it, and instead of 6 months, you're looking at 3 weeks.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like they could have stretched it out a little bit, but I mean, I'm not complaining. It's just, it seems like you had that and you could have toyed around with people a little bit. Because, I mean, hell, they do it with their shows now where they'll release, well, this is part 1, so we're going to release 5 episodes now, and in a few weeks, then we're going to release the other X amount of episodes. It's like, but you're done. Just give it here. It's like, no. We're gonna we're gonna give you a little taste right now, and then you'll get more later. Why didn't I'm curious to know why they didn't try that here. This was a bold, aggressive move to do 1 to 1 to 1. I'm surprised they didn't wait till Halloween, but it's just whatever they wanted to do, that's their business. But week to week to week, and you had 3 movies. You could have easily held on to those. But at the same time, it was fresh up here. You know, so when I finished, I remembered the characters. I remembered everything that was happening. So it didn't feel foreign to me when I came back around to it, which is a problem I would say you have sometimes when you have those gaps between movies. You have to remind yourself, it's like, what happened? Oh, yeah. And they even still do recappers. But I don't know. It's just, it's fascinating to me to think about in terms of how they approached it, what could have been as far as box office. Because I agree. I think it could have been something, and there's no telling what Hollywood would have learned or thought they learned from it, and what trend would have started after this. You know,
in terms of like the production of it, I do think it was really possible just because of the nature of the film. So you're looking at a very low budget production. In terms of actors, it wasn't hard to sign these people up for 106 straight days of shooting. It's not like you're trying to like sign Matt Damon on for 106 straight days, where that would never happen. Dude probably has like 5 movies going on. Like he's signed for 5 movies in a year, and he can only do 2 weeks at a time. Anyway, so like you don't have those kind of like production constraints with this crew, with this cast, whatever. The other thing about like the releasing them back to back to back over 3 consecutive weeks, I think was effective for Netflix, and we can't know what the success of it would have been if it had a longer period between each film. So it kind of works for Netflix because, like you referenced earlier, we're used to waiting a week for content to come out on television. You know, HBO does that for all their new shows. They debut on Sunday night, and they don't dump them all out like Netflix does. So you have to come back. And I think that helps build the buzz. It helps build the word of mouth. It helps build the interest around the show, where people are like, oh man, did you see the latest Game of Thrones? Did you see the latest whatever the new thing is on HBO? That's all. That helps make the shows have a little bit of cultural importance and cachet that something that where you just like dump the whole thing out at one time, it doesn't necessarily have the same thing. And I've talked about on this podcast a lot the Underground Railroad. A lot of people have said like that suffered from the fact that Amazon just, they put the whole thing out where you can't necessarily, you don't build any buzz. Like this was a big ass production made by important filmmakers, and you put the whole thing out at one time and it comes and goes like that. So there's a lot of interest in it. Critics are interested in it based on who's in it and who made it, based on what it's about. But the fact that it's all available at one time and you can get through it in like a weekend or whatever, then it's just done. Whereas something like The Mayor of, what was that HBO show? Well, any HBO show essentially, where it's like this thing is drawn out over a season, more or less, or 10 episodes, so it's 10 weeks time. So it has longevity in the culture. So I think this one had some longevity, but really only 3 weeks. And then when you go back and look at it now, like if you look at the Netflix top 10, these movies aren't on it anymore.
Yeah.
In the 3 weeks that they were showing, or when they were debuting, they were there, you know? Mm-hmm. So the first one probably lasted that 3 week period. The second one was like probably top 10 for that 2 week period. And then they were all maybe still there a few days after the third one launched, but now they're gone. I don't know. It's a case study, and it probably is going to take a lot of data to understand like how these business models are working and what's most effective. But I think it worked for these movies. So like your point towards like, should they have just waited till Halloween?
Yeah.
Maybe that would have been awesome. But they were also probably thinking, well, it's summertime, you know? It's a good time to release a movie or a trilogy of movies where we have a captive audience, where nothing much is going on. And
to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, kind of a capper, and then I'll get your take on it, and maybe this will be an interesting way to end it. I heard today, now I have absolutely no proof this is why this is happening, but I found it odd that this was occurring, and this was our topic, that we were talking about Fear Street, the model that was approached here, and if anyone would copy it. Again, I don't know if this is why they're doing it, but perhaps it is. So I don't know if you heard about this or not, but there was a John Wick prequel in the works. So this is supposed to focus on, I think, Ian McShane's character, whose name eludes me at the moment. The show was supposed to be called The Continental. It was going to be like an 8-10 episode series for Stars. They were going to, whatever it was supposed to be, is supposed to take place, I think, back in the 70s, when all this stuff was like he was young and whatever. I don't really know all the details, but that was supposed to be like the main focus of the show. However, apparently over the last week or so, Starz has decided that they are going to take all those episodes that they had planned for a season of the show, and they're now being retooled into 90-minute TV films for the network. Do you think this could be why? Or do you think it's just a complete coincidence?
no, I think it's a coincidence because I don't think these things happen that fast.
Okay.
But I could be wrong.
It seemed odd. Like, why wouldn't you want to flesh out these characters? Why shift it into 90-minute films when you had a series planned? Again, I'm speculating here at the very best, but it seemed like an odd choice. So I don't know. I have no idea if they're related in that way. If there was a suit sitting somewhere and said, you know what was great, Fear Street. You know what we ought to do? That with John Wick. That'll work. I don't know. But I could see it happening.
Yeah, I can see it happening too. And I don't have any insight about whether that would be a thing. It seems to me that Hollywood probably works a little bit faster than your typical big company, which probably takes many more iterations and many more hands-on things actually changing and shifting course. But Small Axe is another thing that came out at the end of 2020. Mm-hmm. Steve McQueen released a series of movies on Amazon Prime, and they were all released at the same time, just like as if they were television shows, but they were very much they kind of blur the line, just like Fear Street blurs the line a little bit between a movie and a TV show. So that's another thing that we're kind of looking at now is like, when these things can go direct to streaming, of course they have feature-length runtimes, but they're released a week apart. They tell a continuous story, even though they're moderately standalone. Yeah, I think you have executives or people making decisions for content are considering the fact that they're existing in a new landscape in terms of like how to release things. And you've got some experimentation, and some of that experimentation might look the same. So John Wick, the decision to release these as 90-minute films, it might resemble something like Fear Street, but they might be happening in a vacuum where different people are looking at the landscape, but coming to like similar conclusions in order to like capitalize on it.
I'll even give you some numbers based on that, what you're talking about and how the landscape is changing. In the second quarter of 2020, there were 84 movies released on streaming, 50 released on TVOD, which I guess is theater video on demand. I'm just looking at the term. 5 months after being closed, theaters, mind you, like after the 5 months after they were being closed in August, 133 movies went straight to streaming and 132 went straight to theater or TVOD, whatever crap you want to call it. So that's COVID changing the landscape for the time being. It's shifting back open. Everything's trying to come back open, but things can change still. But I honestly feel like this model here, and I know we've talked about this before, but I honestly think this is not going to go away anytime soon. So it's a matter of where do they get the eyes? Where do they get their audience? Is it worth going back to theaters, or do we just stay on demand? Because when you offer that on demand, I mean, Black Widow, I would have easily went to theaters if they'd have made me, but they gave me an out. And instead of waiting, I was like, well, here it is, and just do that. So I don't want theaters to go away. But by God, they're making it too easy just to sit at home and watch movies.
Yeah, I think it depends on, the Disney and Warner Brothers are going to look at the numbers and say, like, is it worth releasing something exclusively to theaters when we can release it to streaming at the same time? Can we cut the theaters out altogether? Like, there's going to be a point at which these people make a decision about the future. It's going to concern the future of theaters for sure. I don't know, and yeah, we don't know how it's gonna play out. There was a big outcry about Black Widow really falling off in the second week, and people, or I guess the thinking was that since it was on Disney Plus, that there was a initial interest in going to see the film in the theaters just because people can do that now. It's a big release and take advantage of it. But after you get rid of all of those initial people who were theater diehards, then the rest of the people who are interested in seeing the movie are just going to watch it on TV. And whether that's the actual case or not, will probably take some time to figure out. But those are all the considerations that people are making, whether or not it's going to be worthwhile to keep putting movies in theaters or whether they're just going to go right to TV, and what kinds of movies go to each platform. Yeah.
I honestly feel that so there are a lot of movies out there we could look at today that you can honestly, like movies that were big in their day, like when we were growing up, that I guarantee you would never make it to theaters today. Like, there's just no way that movie would have made it to theaters because it's just the model's not the same anymore. There used to be prestige to these movies that there was something about them that would draw them into theaters, and now it's just like, well, no one's going to go to theater to see that. They want to see big bang, boom, and spectacle, and boom, boom. You know, stories are meant for TV, not the theater. But I would hardly disagree, but I don't run Hollywood. So it's a shame. But here we are. This is what we're talking about. This is what it's all about and all that. So do you have anything else to add to the Fear Street experiment, as we'll call it?
No, not necessarily. But I know we don't want to do spoilers or anything, and we could even just like end it here. But I just was curious to get your opinion on the movies themselves.
The movies themselves, I really enjoyed quite a bit. The first one, I was really surprised that they all kind of held kind of a vibe to the genre they were trying to reflect upon. Because upon watching the first one, Scream was initially what came to mind. Like the way the killer moved, the way the action and the intensity was kind of laid out.
The opening scene was like a direct homage to the opening of Scream.
Like even going to 78, they found that slasher, the camp slasher genre. I mean, I would say the killer in that went full on Jason. If you've watched,
right, and the location was the same as what's the movie that he was in?
Friday the 13th.
Thank you. The location is the same as Friday the 13th.
See, I didn't know. I need to go deep dive on some of these trivia on some of these because I didn't realize that. But yeah, I could see that. The killer, like I said, he had that vibe. It was like, I do not care. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. And it was just methodical. I wouldn't even say methodical. Senseless slashing. Like, here's my axe. It goes into your head. Boom. Done.
It is. I think it is methodical because there is no thought to it. It's just like they're programmed almost robotically to do this thing. Mm-hmm. They've got no choice about it. There's no thought behind it. There's no reason except for the fact that they're compelled to do it.
Yeah. And then we get to, again, not going to spoil anything, but you get to the third one. And this is the one I honestly thought that I would kind of lose interest because I wasn't sure how the 1666 vibe would kind of go over.
Yeah, I agree.
They didn't. How do I say that? They explain everything that you need to, and then they easily tie up all the loose ends by the last portion of the movie in the best possible way. So it's not like they spend an unnecessary amount of time in that time period. They explain what they have to, they get their point across, and then they come back to our other protagonists from the other movies and then tie it up.
We've talked about origin stories in the past, about especially in regards to horror movies, where I can definitely leave them and don't really want to know what the origin story is behind the monster. And that was my kind of, I was a little bit leery about 1666, like going back into the origin of this whole thing. But the way they did it, and the fact that, well, to avoid spoilers, it's not what you think. Yeah. So they still had a story to tell. So the good thing about this is that there was still story remaining as opposed to like exposition and over-explaining. So that wasn't what they did with this installment. And I also enjoyed the way they did it, where they incorporated or utilized the actors from the present day, 1994, and took them back into 1666, where you're experiencing it through the eyes of the current character and utilizing all of her reference points and all of the people that she knows, as opposed to like casting an entirely new crew or entirely new cast.
Would you say you're wanting more from this, since they've pretty much laid it out as like, hey, there could be more? In fact, the director herself said the gateway to the Marvel universe of horror, which I don't want to hear that. I mean,
no. So,
fascinating idea, but no.
That's the whole thing. another reason I want to talk about this is like, yeah, it's another IP where they're trying to capitalize on it as much as possible. So spinning it off into standalone movies or TV series, and even like in the end credits where they have a shot where it's like, well, okay, that was the end of that, but now there's possibility of more to come. Mm-hmm. And that's just like the business model, I suppose, where, well, and the thing on the positive side, you had a director and she was involved in the writing process as well, who did a good job on this trilogy of movies, right? I'm not going to say that these movies are amazing or going to stand the test of time, but they're well-made movies. They're enjoyable and they're resonant. Like they have something to say about like the time period that we live in, and also kind of refer back to movies in the past in a way that's enjoyable. Yeah. So that's good. You know, like this is a fun trilogy of movies to watch. And so so the fact that the director and one of the writers of this trilogy is like, hey, we want to make more. Well, okay, cool. Yeah. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does speak to the fact that we're living in this time where everyone wants to capitalize to the utmost on anything that's successful, and is also looking at the bigger picture. Like, we don't want to tell a discrete story. We don't want to write a movie that's just a movie. We want to write something that's open-ended, and will keep going on and on and on and on. Right. Which to me is not that interesting, not that exciting. And you've talked about it too, where it's like, can we just focus on making the movie that we're watching? Can we, or the movie that we're making? Can we focus on this as opposed to thinking about this broader universe or this thing that we're trying to expand on? But I don't know. I guess that's just the universe that we live in, right, in terms of movies, content, so to speak.
Always about content.
Yeah. With that said, though, I did enjoy it, and it inspired me. Like we talked about before, I went and watched The Nightmare on Elm Street. As soon as we watched 1666, I told my wife, I was like, Allison, we got to watch The Witch, because not that this was anything like The Witch, except for like the time period and the fact that they tried to replicate period speech. I don't know to what lengths they went to. Like their accents were like all over the place. But I mean, I didn't live in 1666, so who the fuck knows? Like it might have been accurate, but I was like, we got to watch this movie because. So we watched Fear Street 1666, and then we immediately went and watched The Witch. And we also were looking forward Friday the 13th, which wasn't available to stream except for if you subscribe to Stars. But so I liked it enough that I wanted to go back and watch a lot of the movies that it was referring to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely had a lot of fun with it, and not sure I'd want more, because anytime you start making more of something, it can kind of overstay its welcome and wear out the nice sheen on it. But maybe we'll see. If anything else, I would like to see the director move on and get more work. I'd like to see what else she could do, maybe within this genre, maybe outside of it, depending on what she wants to do. But maybe see if she could do something a little bit more original that's maybe hers, if that's something she's interested in. I don't know. Keep it on her and see what happens. If you got nothing else,
let's close it up.
I'll wrap it up. So everyone out there, thank you for listening. If you watch Fear Street, if you have some opinions on the Fear Street trilogy of films on Netflix, let us know. Hit us up on the Twitters at wherever you can find us. You can hashtag Cinema Salsa. Maybe we'll find it. Tell your friends to find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor, Radio Public, even youtube.com/Pencil Paper Productions. Wherever you want to listen to it, that's where we're trying to be. So keep your eyes open, and if we're not on your favorite platform yet, maybe we will be soon. Be sure to join us again next week. Support your local theaters, and we'll see you next time.
This has been a Pencil and Paper Podcast Network production.